In the year 1234, a woman named Beatrice de Planesol stood before the Inquisition in southern France, accused not of heresy but of living openly with a priest. Her testimony, recorded in Latin and preserved for 7 centuries, offers one of the most candid accounts of intimate life in medieval Europe, a world where desire, law, religion, and survival were woven together in ways both familiar and utterly strange. This exploration moves through the lived realities of intimacy, marriage, and bodily life in medieval Europe, from the 12th to the 15th centuries. It passes through theology and folk belief, legal codes and medical texts, marriage beds and monasteries, to understand how ordinary people navigated desire in a world governed by the Church, shaped by scarcity, and animated by beliefs largely forgotten. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 codified marriage as a sacrament and required public bans. Gratian's Decretum, compiled around 1140, became the foundational text of canon law governing marriage and conduct. Thomas Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica between 1265 and 1274, systematizing Catholic doctrine on marriage and sin. Yet between the Latin of theologians and the daily lives of farmers, merchants, and artisans lay a vast and complicated territory where people improvised, confessed, resisted, and carried on. Beatrice de Planesols was not exceptional in her transgressions. She was exceptional in being interrogated about them in such exhaustive detail. The inquisitor who questioned her was Jacques Fournier, later Pope Benedict XII, a man of terrifying precision who conducted trials in the mountain town of Pamia between 1318 and 1325. His scribes recorded everything: who slept with whom, what heretical beliefs circulated in kitchens and workshops, what remedies midwives recommended, what priests said in bed to their lovers. Beatrice testified that her priest gave her a wrapped bundle of herbs to prevent pregnancy, telling her to wear it between her breasts while they lay together. She described how he reassured her that their intimacy was no sin, since they harmed no one, and felt affection for each other. She also admitted that when the relationship soured, she handed the bundle to another woman as a kind of bitter gift. These details, the herbs, the reassurance, the petty vengeance, open a window into a world where official doctrine and lived experience existed in constant negotiation. Medieval people did not live in ignorance of the Church's teachings. They knew that fornication was a sin, that marriage was a sacrament, that priests were supposed to be celibate, but they also lived in a material world of hunger, cold, cramped housing, and uncertain futures. Many marriages were arranged to consolidate land, settle debts, or forge alliances between families. Love, if it came later. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high. Widowhood was common, and remarriage often swift. In this context, intimacy served many purposes: procreation, certainly, but also comfort, survival, and the occasional defiant assertion of personal will. The Church attempted to regulate every aspect of bodily life. Penitential manuals catalogued sins with startling specificity, prescribing penances measured in days or years of fasting depending on the act, the participants, and the circumstances. Married couples were instructed to abstain on Sundays, feast days, fast days, during Lent and Advent, during menstruation, pregnancy, and 40 days after childbirth. One medieval calculator, tallying all the prohibited days, concluded that married intimacy was permissible on fewer than half the days of the year. Whether anyone actually observed these restrictions is another question entirely. Confessors heard the same sins week after week. Synodal records document priests repeatedly admonished for keeping concubines. Court cases reveal that ordinary people knew perfectly well how to prevent or end pregnancies, despite the Church's condemnation. This gap between prescription and practice was not hypocrisy so much as the inevitable friction between an institution that claimed universal authority and the stubborn complexity of human life. Medieval Christianity was not a monolith. It was lived differently in a village in Yorkshire than in a merchant household in Florence, differently by a labourer than by a duchess, differently in 1200 than in 1450. What remained constant was the conviction that the body mattered, that desire had consequences, and that the line between the sacred and the profane was always blurred, always contested, always in need of vigilant maintenance. Medical theory added another layer to this understanding. Physicians trained in the universities of Paris, Bologna, and Salerno inherited a framework from ancient Greece and the Islamic world that understood health as a balance of humors. Men were hot and dry, women cold and moist. Conception required both male and female seed, released in mutual pleasure. The Trotula, a collection of medical texts on women's health compiled in 12th century Salerno, circulated widely and offered advice on fertility, childbirth, and bodily care. It recommended specific positions, diets, and timing to encourage conception. It also included remedies for women who wished to appear virginal on their wedding night, acknowledging a social reality that theology preferred to ignore. This medical knowledge coexisted with folk practices passed down orally and adapted locally. Charms invoking Saint Margaret ensured safe delivery. Amulets worn around the neck or tucked into clothing were thought to protect against miscarriage or ensure a male child. Herbal remedies, some effective, some dangerous, some mere superstition, were prepared by midwives, healers, and village women who learned from their mothers and grandmothers. The church condemned magic but tolerated sacramentals, holy water, blessed candles, relics of saints. The boundary between the two was often unclear in practice, and many people saw no contradiction in invoking both God and older powers when it came to the mysteries of birth and death. The legal landscape was equally layered. Canon law governed marriage and annulment, but secular law handled rape, adultery, and prostitution. Different courts claimed jurisdiction over different offences, and the same act might be judged differently depending on who committed it and where. A nobleman accused of keeping a mistress might face a fine or a slap on the wrist. A poor woman accused of prostitution might be publicly whipped or branded. Yet even here the record reveals unexpected flexibility. Women could petition ecclesiastical courts for separation on grounds of cruelty or impotence. Some won. Annulments, though expensive and difficult, were pursued by peasants as well as princes. Legal records preserve the voices of women arguing for their rights, men defending their reputations, and clerics attempting to enforce a moral order that was always slipping through their fingers. What emerges from these sources? Inquisition registers, penitential manuals, medical treatises, court records, sermons, letters, and the occasional bawdy poem is not a single story, but a chorus. Theologians and ordinary believers, physicians and midwives, priests and their lovers, all inhabited the same world but understood it differently. The medieval approach to intimacy was neither as repressive as sometimes imagined, nor as liberated as romantics might hope. It was pragmatic and dogmatic, tender and transactional, governed by forces both spiritual and material. People married for duty and found affection. They sinned and confessed and sinned again. They sought saints' intercession for fertility and whispered charms learned from grandmothers. They navigated a world saturated with religious meaning, but never fully controlled by it. To understand medieval intimacy is to understand a society where the boundaries between public and private, sacred and profane, body and soul, were drawn differently than they are now. It is to see people making choices within constraints, asserting agency where they could, and living lives that were both more regulated and more surprising than the textbooks suggest. The story begins not with abstract doctrine, but with the voices of those who lived it, preserved in the records of those who sought to judge them. In November of 1215, more than 400 bishops gathered in Rome for what would become one of the most consequential gatherings in church history. Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council not merely to address heresy or crusade, but to reform the institutional fabric of Christian life itself. Among 70 decrees issued over 3 weeks, one addressed marriage with unprecedented precision. The council declared marriage to be one of 7 sacraments, elevated it to the status of baptism and communion, and mandated that banns be read publicly in church for 3 consecutive weeks before any wedding could proceed. This was not simply ceremonial. Public announcement gave communities the chance to expose impediments, prior contracts, forbidden degrees of kinship, existing vows. The decree transformed marriage from a sometimes private arrangement into a matter of explicit ecclesiastical jurisdiction and communal witness. The bishops at Lateran built upon legal foundations laid decades earlier. Around 1140, a Benedictine monk named Gratian compiled what would become the foundational text of canon law, the Decretum, formerly titled the Concordance of Discordant Canons. Gratian gathered centuries of papal letters, conciliar rulings, and patristic writings, organizing them into a coherent legal framework. On marriage, his synthesis was revolutionary. He established that consent between the two parties, freely given and expressed in words of the present tense, constituted the essence of a valid union. Consummation mattered, but it was consent that created the bond. A man and woman speaking the words "I take you" before witnesses were married, whether or not a priest blessed them, whether or not they ever shared a bed. This principle, consent as the sacramental hinge, granted individuals a degree of agency that secular custom often denied. Parents could pressure, lords could arrange, but if either party withheld genuine assent, the marriage could be challenged. Gratian's work circulated widely among canonists and ecclesiastical judges. By the 13th century, it formed the backbone of church courts across Europe, institutions that heard thousands of marriage cases each year. Peasants and townspeople brought disputes over broken betrothals, contested unions, and alleged coercion. The records reveal people navigating a system that was both rigid and surprisingly accessible. A woman in York claimed her husband had forced her into marriage while threatening violence. A man in Paris argued that his bride had been contracted to another man first. The courts examined witnesses, tested credibility, and issued verdicts. They did not always side with the powerful. Some women won separations, some annulments were granted to parties of modest means. The law, in theory and sometimes in practice, recognized that marriage required mutual will. Yet the Church's concern extended far beyond the validity of marriage itself. Once married, couples entered a realm of detailed regulation governing what they could and could not do within the marriage bed. Thomas Aquinas, writing his Summa Theologica between 1265 and 1274, synthesized Augustinian moral theology with Aristotelian natural philosophy to produce the definitive scholastic treatment of marital intimacy. Aquinas taught that the sexual act was morally licit only within marriage and only when ordered toward procreation. Pleasure accompanying the act was not sinful in itself. God had designed the body to experience pleasure as an inducement to the duty of generation, but to pursue pleasure as the primary end, to act in ways that deliberately frustrated conception, was to invert the natural order and commit sin. The severity of the sin depended on intent and circumstance. A couple who engaged in relations during pregnancy, when conception was impossible, committed a venial sin if done for mutual comfort. The same act, performed with contraceptive intent or in a manner deemed unnatural, could be mortal. Aquinas drew heavily on Augustine of Hippo, who 6 centuries earlier had argued that original sin was transmitted through the act of conception itself, carried in the disordered desire that accompanied intercourse. Augustine had been deeply suspicious of pleasure, viewing it as a reminder of humanity's fallen state. Aquinas softened this somewhat, insisting that marital relations performed dutifully and without excessive passion were blameless. He also borrowed from Aristotle's biology, which held that the male seed was the active formative principle and the female body provided passive matter. This gendered asymmetry shaped theological reasoning about fertility, impotence, and the respective roles of husband and wife. A marriage could be annulled if the husband was impotent. Since procreation was impossible, female sterility, harder to prove and understood differently, was rarely grounds for annulment. The practical application of these principles fell to confessors, who heard the intimate details of marital life during the sacrament of penance. Penitential manuals, written for priests with varying levels of education, offered detailed taxonomies of sexual sin. They listed permissible and forbidden positions, appropriate and inappropriate times, licit and illicit acts. Relations were forbidden during menstruation, pregnancy, and the 40 days following childbirth. They were forbidden on Sundays, feast days, and during Lent. Some manuals specified that the missionary position was the only truly natural one, as it alone properly ordered male above female. Others were less rigid, but still insisted that any act preventing conception or pursued solely for pleasure required confession and penance. The manuals walked a fine line, attempting to regulate behavior without unduly burdening laypeople or encouraging ignorance. Some priests questioned penitence gently. Others, zealous or anxious, pressed for explicit detail. The records suggest wide variation in practice. Despite this thicket of doctrine, annulment remained a recognized and frequently pursued remedy. Grounds included consanguinity, affinity through prior relationships, spiritual kinship established by godparenthood, impotence, coercion, and prior vows of celibacy or engagement to another. The medieval church took kinship prohibitions seriously, at times forbidding marriage within 7 degrees of relation, later reduced to 4, later and 4. Noble families, intermarried over generations, often found themselves entangled in webs of forbidden kinship. Annulment on these grounds became a strategic tool, deployed when alliances soured or heirs failed to arrive. But ordinary people used the system too. A wife in Bologna sought annulment after discovering her husband had been betrothed to her cousin years earlier. A servant in England claimed his bride had coerced him while he was drunk. Both cases required testimony, investigation, and judgment. The process could take months or years, and legal fees could be ruinous. Yet people pursued it because marriage was binding and escape was otherwise impossible. The doctrine of impotence deserves particular attention, as it reveals both the Church's commitment to procreation and the uncomfortable scrutiny that commitment entailed. If a husband could not consummate the marriage, the union could be dissolved, since its primary purpose was impossible. Proof, however, was required. Some cases involved medical examination, others relied on witness testimony, occasionally from female relatives who inspected the wife to confirm virginity. In rare instances, courts ordered trial by Congress, requiring the couple to attempt intercourse under supervised conditions. These procedures were invasive and humiliating, yet they were pursued because annulment offered the only exit from a legally indissoluble bond. Women sometimes brought impotence cases to escape abusive or incompatible husbands. Men occasionally fabricated claims to dissolve inconvenient marriages. The Church, committed to the sanctity of marriage but also to its purpose, allowed the door to remain narrowly open. By the late 13th century, the sacramental architecture of marriage was firmly in place. Consent, witnessed, and often blessed, created the bond. Procreation justified the act. Canon law offered mechanisms for validation and dissolution. Theology mapped the boundaries of licit desire. This was the blueprint taught in universities, enforced in courts, and preached from pulpits. It was written in Latin, debated by scholars, and encoded in texts that circulated among the educated elite. It represented the Church's vision of how human intimacy should be ordered, sacramental, procreative, and bound within marriage's sacred enclosure. It was a vision of remarkable coherence and ambition, a comprehensive attempt to govern the most intimate dimensions of human life. But theology written in Latin was one thing. The beliefs and practices of ordinary laypeople, many of them illiterate, were another matter entirely. Theology written in Latin was one thing. The beliefs and practices of ordinary laypeople, many of them illiterate, were another matter entirely. In villages and market towns across medieval Europe, people navigated their intimate lives through a vast and tangled web of devotions, charms, remedies, and rituals that owed as much to ancestral memory as to the teachings of the Church. A peasant woman in Languedoc, who wanted to conceive a child or prevent one, or ease the agony of labor, did not consult Thomas Aquinas. She went to the midwife who lived 3 houses down, or whispered a prayer to a saint whose name had been passed from mother to daughter for generations. She might tie a scrap of parchment inscribed with holy words around her wrist, or brew a tea from herbs gathered at dawn on the feast of St. John. She lived in a world where the sacred and the practical were not separate categories, and where the line between piety and magic was often impossible to see. Saints occupied a central place in this landscape of popular devotion. Women in labor called upon Margaret of Antioch, the virgin martyr, who, according to legend, had been swallowed by a dragon and emerged unharmed. The parallel was clear enough. As Margaret had burst forth from the beast, so might a child emerge safely from the womb. Her image appeared on amulets worn around the neck, and her name was invoked in prayers murmured by midwives as they pressed their hands against a laboring woman's belly. Agatha, another virgin martyr, became the patron of nursing mothers after her breasts were torn from her body during her torture. Women with insufficient milk or inflamed breasts petitioned her intercession, sometimes touching relics or kissing images of the saint while reciting prayers. These devotions were not considered heterodox. Parish priests encouraged them, and churches displayed paintings and statues of the saints precisely for this purpose. The church understood that abstract doctrine meant little to people whose survival depended on successful childbirth and healthy infants. Yet the same women who prayed to Margaret might also carry a small cloth bag filled with herbs, written charms, or stones believed to possess protective power. These amulets blended Christian and older elements with cheerful disregard for theological boundaries. A charm might invoke the Trinity and the Virgin Mary in the same breath as ingredients drawn from pre-Christian fertility rites. Sprigs of vervain gathered under a full moon, a fragment of iron to ward off malevolent spirits, a thread knotted 3 times while speaking the names of saints. The words themselves often lost their meaning over generations of oral transmission, becoming sacred sounds rather than intelligible language. Inquisition records from the early 14th century preserve examples of such charms, transcribed phonetically by clerks who clearly had no idea what they meant. One woman in the Pyrenees told Jacques Fournier that her grandmother had taught her a prayer to ensure conception, a string of syllables that mingled Latin, Occitan, and something older still, worn smooth like a river stone. Herbal remedies circulated through networks of women that operated largely outside clerical oversight. Midwives, healers, and older female relatives were repositories of knowledge about plants that could provoke menstruation, ease labor pains, or increase fertility. Some of this knowledge was empirically sound. Raspberry leaf did tone the uterus, and certain preparations of willow bark did reduce pain. Other remedies were less effective but perhaps no less comforting, offering a sense of agency in the face of uncertainty. A woman might drink a tea made from lady's mantle to aid conception, or place a sprig of mugwort under her pillow to dream of her future husband. These practices existed in a grey zone. The church did not condemn the use of medicinal herbs, which were understood as part of God's creation and gifts of natural philosophy. What troubled ecclesiastical authorities was the creep toward magic, the belief that certain words or rituals could compel outcomes through supernatural means, bypassing the will of God. The boundary between sanctioned sacramentals and condemned magic was vague in daily life, and most people simply did not think in those terms. Holy water blessed by a priest was unquestionably legitimate, a channel of divine grace. Yet what was the difference in practice between sprinkling holy water around a marriage bed to encourage conception and burying a chicken bone at the threshold to keep a husband faithful? Both were rituals intended to shape the invisible forces that governed human life. Both assumed that the material world and the spiritual world were intimately connected, and that the right actions could influence outcomes. The church insisted that sacramentals worked through the power of God, while magic worked through demonic agency or superstition. Ordinary laypeople often saw them as points on a continuum, tools to be used as circumstances required. A crucifix hung above the door was protection. So was a horseshoe. One came from the priest, the other from the blacksmith, but both were part of the same strategy for survival. Inquisition records, especially those compiled by Jacques Fournier in the village of Montaillou and surrounding areas between 1318 and 1325, offer rare glimpses into this layered world of belief. Fournier was meticulous, even obsessive, in his questioning, and he recorded testimony with an eye for detail that makes his registers among the most vivid sources we have for medieval daily life. His witnesses spoke of love potions made from menstrual blood mixed into wine, a practice that was both widespread and deeply troubling to church authorities. They described fertility rituals performed at springs believed to be sacred, places where women would bathe or drink the water while reciting prayers. They mentioned folk midwives who combined practical skills with spiritual authority, women who knew how to turn a breech baby in the womb, and also how to speak charms that would ease a difficult birth. These midwives occupied an ambiguous position. They were essential, trusted, and often the only medical assistants available. Yet they were also suspect, operating in the intimate spaces of women's bodies where male clerics could not go, wielding knowledge that seemed perilously close to sorcery. Beatrice de Planisols, whose testimony before Fournier survives in remarkable detail, provides a case study in how lay people negotiated their own moral boundaries around intimacy. Beatrice was the widow of a minor noble, educated enough to read a bit of Latin, but firmly rooted in the customs and beliefs of her rural community. She lived openly with a priest named Pierre Clergue for several years, a relationship that was illicit by canon law, but tolerated by her neighbors. In her testimony, Beatrice described how Pierre had convinced her that their relationship was not sinful because he genuinely loved her, an argument that found no support in official theology, but apparently made sense to both of them. She also admitted using herbal preparations to prevent pregnancy, though she insisted she did not know they were sinful because the priest himself had provided them. Whether this was true or a convenient claim in front of the Inquisitor is impossible to say. What matters is that Beatrice lived in a moral world shaped less by abstract doctrine than by relationships, local custom, and practical necessity. She prayed to the Virgin, attended Mass, and kept a lover who gave her contraceptive herbs. She saw no contradiction. This flexibility extended to matters of fertility and desire, in ways that would have horrified the theologians writing in Paris or Bologna. Women traded knowledge of aphrodisiacs made from ground beetles or mandrake root, substances believed to inflame desire and ensure pleasure. Men consulted cunning folk for remedies to restore potency, sometimes involving elaborate rituals performed at crossroads or during specific phases of the moon. These practices existed alongside Christian devotion, not in opposition to it. A man might attend confession on Sunday and visit a village healer on Monday, asking for a charm to win the affections of a particular woman. The healer might give him a bag of herbs to wear around his neck, inscribed with a prayer to Saint Christopher. Was this magic or medicine? Was it prayer or manipulation? The categories were unclear, and perhaps that was the point. Life was uncertain, survival precarious, and any tool that offered hope was worth trying. The Church tried repeatedly to suppress what it deemed superstitious or magical, but enforcement was inconsistent and often half-hearted. Parish priests were supposed to preach against charms and divination, but many of them came from the same communities and understood why people turned to such practices. A vicar might warn his flock against consulting healers, while quietly acknowledging that the midwife down the lane had saved 3 lives that winter. Bishops issued decrees condemning the use of love potions and fertility charms, then discovered that their own household servants kept amulets sewn into their clothing. The gap between official teaching and lived practice was wide, and the Church, for all its ambitions, could not close it. What remained was a hybrid spirituality, deeply Christian in its emotional core, but shaped by older patterns of thought and ritual, a tradition that saw the world as animated by invisible forces that could be courted, appeased, or compelled. This blending of sacred and practical extended to the body itself, which medieval medicine understood as a system of fluids, temperatures, and cosmic correspondences. The body itself was a landscape. It was a terrain of fluids and temperatures, a balance held in place by forces both visible and hidden. When medieval physicians spoke of health, they did not speak of cells or bacteria or chemical reactions. They spoke of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These were the 4 cardinal fluids, and their proportion within the body determined not only health and illness, but also temperament, appetite, and the capacity for desire. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a discipline of correspondence. It linked the body to the cosmos, the seasons to the organs, the planets to the humours themselves. This was the inheritance of Galen, the 2nd century physician, whose works had been translated and commented upon for more than a millennium, and of Avicenna, whose Canon of Medicine became the standard textbook of European universities after its translation into Latin in the 12th century. Together, these texts formed the foundation of a medical system that saw the body not as a machine, but as a living system of heat, moisture, dryness, and cold. Men were understood to be hot and dry, women were cold and moist. This was not metaphor, it was physiology. Heat was generative, the force that cooked raw matter into life. Men possessed this heat in abundance, which explained their stronger frames, their deeper voices, their capacity for reason and action. Women, by contrast, lacked sufficient internal heat. Their bodies were softer, moister, more porous. This coldness was not a defect. It was a necessary condition for fertility. The womb was a cool, moist chamber where seed could take root and grow, much as a garden required damp soil to nurture a plant. Without this difference in temperature, conception would be impossible. The medieval body was a body of asymmetry, and reproduction depended on it. Conception itself required more than the union of bodies. It required the union of seeds. This was the teaching of Galen, and it persisted throughout the medieval period despite some theological resistance. Both men and women were believed to produce seed, though the seeds differed in quality and potency. Male seed was hot, thick, and generative. Female seed was cooler, thinner, and receptive. The act of intercourse brought these seeds together, and if conditions were right, if the humors were balanced and the timing was favorable, the seeds would mingle and a new life would begin. The sex of the child depended on which seed was stronger, which side of the womb it implanted upon, and how much heat was present at the moment of conception. A child conceived in great heat, on the right side of the womb, with dominant male seed, would be a boy. A child conceived in lesser heat, on the left side, with dominant female seed, would be a girl. This framework shaped not only theory, but practice. Physicians offered detailed advice on how to encourage conception, and much of it centered on manipulating heat and moisture within the body. Diet was crucial. Foods that increased heat and dryness in men, such as meat, wine, and spices, were recommended. Foods that increased moisture in women, such as milk, eggs, and certain vegetables, were thought to prepare the womb for implantation. Timing mattered as well. The best time for conception was believed to be shortly after menstruation, when the womb was cleansed and the woman's body was neither too hot nor too cold. Some texts recommended specific positions during intercourse, favoring those that allowed the seed to flow most directly into the womb and remain there undisturbed. The Trotula, a collection of medical writings on women's health compiled in Salerno in the 12th century, circulated widely across Europe and became one of the most influential guides to fertility and childbirth. It advised women to lie still after intercourse, to avoid sudden movement, and to place herbs beneath their hips to encourage the retention of seed. Desire itself was understood as a medical phenomenon. It was not merely an emotion or a moral state. It was a condition of the body produced by an excess of heat and moisture in the genitals. This excess created pressure, a build-up of seed that demanded release. In men, this was relatively straightforward. The heat of their bodies naturally produced seed, and sexual activity or nocturnal emissions relieved the pressure. In women, the mechanism was more complex. Some physicians believed that women produced seed only during intercourse, stimulated by the friction and heat of the act itself. Others argued that women produced seed independently, and that prolonged abstinence could lead to a dangerous accumulation. This condition, sometimes called suffocation of the womb, was thought to cause a range of symptoms: melancholy, fainting, difficulty breathing, and irrational behavior. The prescribed remedy was marriage and regular intercourse, though widows and nuns presented a more delicate problem. For them, physicians sometimes recommended physical manipulation by midwives or the application of warm oils and pessaries to relieve the congestion. The balance of humors could be disrupted by many factors. Excessive heat led to lust, aggression, and an overabundance of yellow bile. Excessive cold led to sluggishness, frigidity, and an accumulation of phlegm. Physicians prescribed remedies to restore equilibrium. Cooling foods such as lettuce, cucumbers, and barley water were given to those suffering from an excess of heat. Warming foods such as ginger, pepper, and wine were given to those who were too cold. Bloodletting was a common intervention, used to reduce the volume of blood and thereby cool the body. Certain herbs were thought to affect desire directly. Rue and Agnus castus were believed to dampen lust, and were sometimes recommended for monks and nuns. Conversely, rocket, parsnips, and pine nuts were thought to inflame desire and were considered aphrodisiacs. These remedies were not restricted to the wealthy. They circulated in simplified form through oral tradition, passed from mothers to daughters, from midwives to labouring women, from one household to another. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages existed on multiple registers: the Latin texts of Galen and Avicenna, the commentaries of Constantinus Africanus and Gerard of Cremona, the encyclopedic works of Albertus Magnus and Arnold of Villanova. These were the domain of university-trained physicians, men who read Latin and Greek, who understood the logic of Aristotelian biology and the algebra of humoral diagnosis. But this knowledge did not remain locked in libraries. It filtered downward and outward, translated into vernacular languages, excerpted in popular health guides, and simplified in handbooks for surgeons, barbers, and apothecaries. Midwives learned the rudiments of humoral theory through apprenticeship and experience. They could diagnose an imbalance by examining urine, feeling the pulse, and observing the color of the skin and tongue. They knew which herbs cooled and which warmed, which positions eased labor, and which diets encouraged milk production. This was practical knowledge, tested and refined through generations of practice. The persistence of these ideas is striking. Long after the printing press made medical texts more widely available, long after anatomical dissection began to reveal the actual structure of the reproductive organs, the humoral framework endured. It endured because it was coherent. It explained not only health and illness, but also personality, emotion, and the vast differences between male and female bodies. It endured because it was flexible. When new observations challenged old conclusions, the system could be adjusted, reinterpreted, expanded, and it endured because it was embedded in daily life. The foods people ate, the baths they took, the timing of marital intimacy, the care of pregnant women, all of these practices were shaped by humoral logic. To reject the humours was to reject a worldview, and worldviews do not collapse easily. This medical framework shaped not only how people sought to conceive children, but also how they attempted to avoid conception when circumstances demanded it. Medical theory provided the framework for understanding fertility, but ordinary people faced a more immediate question: what could be done when another pregnancy threatened survival itself? In households already stretched thin by hunger, debt, or the death of a previous infant, conception was not always a blessing. The Church condemned any attempt to thwart God's design for procreation, yet the knowledge of how to prevent or end a pregnancy circulated widely, passed from woman to woman in kitchens, markets, and birthing chambers. The gap between what theology demanded and what necessity required was one that countless medieval people navigated in silence, confessing only when fear or conscience compelled them. The simplest method required no preparation at all. Withdrawal before completion, known in Latin as coitus interruptus, appears repeatedly in penitential manuals and confessional guides. Theologians condemned it as a grave sin, citing the fate of Onan in Genesis, struck down for spilling his seed upon the ground. Yet the very frequency with which confessors were instructed to ask about this practice suggests how common it was. It cost nothing, required no special knowledge, and left no physical evidence. For couples already burdened by children they could barely feed, it was a choice made in the dark, weighed against the sin of bringing another mouth into a world with too little bread. Other methods required more deliberate preparation. Pessaries, small plugs or sponges soaked in vinegar, honey, or herbal extracts, could be inserted before intimacy to block or kill seed. Medical texts from Salerno and translations of Arabic works described their use in clinical terms, though always with the caveat that such knowledge was meant for physicians treating illness, not for preventing healthy conception. Linen or thin animal membranes, shaped and tied, occasionally appear in sources as barriers, though their use was sporadic and their effectiveness uncertain. These methods belong to a shadowy economy of female knowledge, discussed rarely in writing, but understood widely in practice. Herbal preparations formed the largest and most varied category. Pennyroyal, a member of the mint family, was perhaps the most notorious abortifacient in medieval Europe. Taken as a tea or tincture, It could provoke bleeding and expel an early pregnancy, though the line between an effective dose and a lethal one was perilously thin. Rue, with its bitter leaves and strong scent, was another common choice, believed to bring on delayed menstruation and loosen the womb. Savin, a type of juniper, was so closely associated with abortion that its very possession could arouse suspicion. These plants grew in gardens, hedgerows, and wild places, their uses passed down orally and rarely committed to parchment. When they do appear in medical manuscripts, they are often framed as remedies for amenorrhea or womb ailments, the true intent left unspoken. The efficacy of these herbs varied wildly. Some worked reliably at certain doses, others did little beyond causing nausea or cramps, and a few proved fatal to the woman as often as they ended the pregnancy. Medieval healers had no understanding of hormones or embryonic development, only generations of trial and observation. A woman who sought such a remedy took a gamble, trusting in the knowledge of a midwife, neighbor, or kinswoman who had seen it work before. Many of these plants also had legitimate medicinal uses, which provided a degree of cover. A sprig of pennyroyal might be for indigestion, a bundle of rue might be for fever. The church could condemn the intent, but proving intent was another matter. Theologically, the church's position was unambiguous. Contraception and abortion were mortal sins, offences against the natural order and the divine command to be fruitful and multiply. Augustine had argued that any act that deliberately frustrated procreation turned the marriage bed into a brothel, a place of lust rather than sanctified union. By the 13th century, this view had hardened into formal doctrine. Thomas Aquinas classified contraception and abortion alongside homicide, arguing that both destroyed potential life and violated God's plan. Some penitential manuals assigned penances of 7 to 10 years of fasting for a woman who procured an abortion, the same penalty given for murder. Others drew distinctions based on the stage of pregnancy, with early terminations treated more lenily than later ones, though all remained serious sins. Enforcement, however, was inconsistent and often shaped by circumstance. Confessors were instructed to inquire gently about such matters, mindful that shame might prevent honest confession. In practice, many priests granted lighter penances when poverty, illness, or desperation was involved. A widow with 4 hungry children might receive a penance of weeks rather than years. A woman whose health had nearly failed in her last birth might be counseled toward abstinence rather than punished for preventing the next. The gap between canon law and pastoral practice was wide, and into that gap fell a great deal of human pragmatism. The church could legislate in councils and write in books, but the priest in the confessional often faced a parishioner whose survival depended on choices theology did not accommodate. The primary keepers of this knowledge were women, and among them midwives held a position of particular authority and suspicion. Midwives attended births, treated female ailments, and advised on matters of fertility and its prevention. Their knowledge was rooted in experience rather than texts, learned through apprenticeship and observation rather than university training. Inquisition records and court documents reveal that women accused of heresy or witchcraft were often questioned about abortifacients and contraceptives, as though possessing such knowledge was itself evidence of moral transgression. In 1324, a midwife named Jacoba in Toulouse was accused of providing herbs to women seeking to avoid pregnancy. Her defense was pragmatic. She treated illness and suffering, and a woman worn down by repeated births was, in her view, ill. The ecclesiastical court disagreed, and she was forbidden from practicing. Yet the same courts also reveal how deeply embedded this knowledge was in daily life. Women testified that they had received herbal advice from mothers, aunts, and neighbors. Some admitted to using pessaries or tinctures only after a confessor pressed them. Others claimed ignorance, insisting they had taken the herbs for cramps or irregular bleeding, unaware of their other effects. The law could punish individuals, but it could not erase the networks through which such knowledge traveled. As long as women faced the prospect of dangerous childbirth, poverty, or the death of existing children, the demand for some measure of control would persist. Men were not absent from these practices, but their role was often indirect. A husband might know that his wife consulted a midwife or drank a certain tea, but the details were left unspoken. Physicians occasionally prescribed remedies that had contraceptive or abortifacient properties, framing them as treatments for blockages or imbalances of the womb. The language of medicine provided a layer of plausible deniability, a way to offer help without acknowledging the true purpose. In this way, the male-dominated institutions of the church and the university coexisted uneasily with a parallel world of female knowledge and agency, neither able to fully suppress the other. By the 14th and 15th centuries, increasing urbanization and the disruptions of plague created new pressures. In cities where households were smaller and wages more precarious, the economic calculus of childbearing shifted. Servants and laborers living in cramped quarters and dependent on uncertain income had fewer resources to support large families. The demographic collapse after 1348 briefly eased the pressure as labor shortages raised wages and land became more available. But by the early 15th century, population growth resumed, and with it came renewed scrutiny of reproductive practices. Preachers railed against the sin of preventing births. Synods issued new prohibitions, yet the methods endured, adapted to new circumstances, and passed quietly from one generation to the next. What remains striking is the tension between the absolute nature of theological condemnation and the lived complexity of enforcement. Medieval people were neither uniformly obedient nor uniformly rebellious. They confessed, performed penance, and sometimes repeated the same acts when necessity arose again. The church shaped their understanding of sin and salvation, but it could not eliminate the fundamental human impulse to exert some control over the rhythms of fertility and survival. Contraception and abortion existed in the shadows, neither fully hidden nor openly acknowledged, a testament to the limits of doctrine when it collided with the demands of daily life. The reality of intimacy, however, extended beyond procreation and prevention to the daily negotiations of marriage itself. Marriage in medieval Europe was both a sacrament and a contract, a union blessed by the church and negotiated by families with land, livestock, and lineage in mind. What happened inside that union, however, was subject to a different set of rules altogether. The marriage bed was not a private refuge. It was a place of duty, carefully regulated by theology and law, where husband and wife enacted obligations as binding as any spoken vow. The church taught that intimacy between spouses was lawful, even necessary, but it was never entirely free. Every act carried moral weight, every refusal potential sin, every pleasure a question of intent. The doctrine that governed this intimate obligation was known as the marital debt, and it rested on a single verse from the first letter to the Corinthians. The husband, Paul wrote, should give to his wife what is due to her, and likewise the wife to her husband. Neither spouse had authority over their own body, but yielded it to the other. This principle, repeated and elaborated across centuries of commentary, meant that either partner could demand conjugal relations, and the other was required to consent. Refusal, in the eyes of canon law, was a sin. It deprived the spouse of a right granted by the sacrament itself, and in doing so, risked pushing them toward adultery or other transgressions. The logic was relentless. If marriage was the only lawful outlet for desire, then spouses owed each other access to that outlet, regardless of personal inclination. Yet the church, aware of the body's frailties and the calendar's demands, carved out exceptions. A spouse could refuse during menstruation, when the woman was believed to be ritually impure and conception thought dangerous or defective. Pregnancy and the period immediately following childbirth also warranted abstinence, though the duration varied by source and confessor. Illness, physical exhaustion, or the risk of harm to either party could justify temporary refusal. So too could the liturgical calendar. Advent, Lent, Ember Days, vigils before major feasts, Sundays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were all times when marital relations were discouraged or forbidden outright. One 14th century manual calculated that if a couple observed every restriction, they would be left with fewer than half the nights of the year. Whether anyone actually followed this regimen is another matter. Confessors, dealing with real people in real marriages, often granted leniency. The ideal was strict, the practice more forgiving. Penitential manuals went further still, prescribing not only when, but how married couples should come together. The acceptable position was missionary, face-to-face, man above woman. This arrangement was deemed natural, reflecting the hierarchy of creation and ensuring that seed would not be wasted. Variations were suspect. Rear entry was compared to the mating of animals and carried penances ranging from 10 days to 3 years, depending on the text and the frequency of the offense. The woman atop the man inverted the proper order and was similarly condemned, though some confessors argued it was permissible if pregnancy or illness made the standard position painful. Oral contact, manual stimulation pursued for its own sake, and any act that concluded outside the body were classified as unnatural and subject to severe penance. Even within marriage, pleasure was acceptable only as a byproduct of procreative intent. To seek pleasure for itself, to linger over sensation, to pursue satisfaction apart from the possibility of conception, was to reduce the sacrament to mere indulgence. What couples actually did behind closed doors, of course, is largely unrecorded. The sources that survive are prescriptive, written by celibate men for the guidance of priests hearing confession. They tell us what the church wanted, not necessarily what people practiced. Occasionally a fragment slips through. Inquisition records capture offhand remarks. Court cases reveal allegations made in anger. A wife in 14th century York accused her husband of demanding acts she found shameful and painful. A man in 15th century France sought annulment on the grounds that his wife refused him entirely, claiming illness when none existed. These glimpses are rare, but they suggest a gap between doctrine and daily life, between the marital debt as theology and the marital debt as lived experience. For many couples, marriage began not with affection, but with arrangement. Parents and kin negotiated dowries, assessed lineages, and weighed economic advantage. A daughter married into a household that could support her. A son secured land or trade connections. Love was not expected at the outset, though moralists insisted it could grow over time. Letters and wills from the later Middle Ages provide some evidence that it did. A London merchant in 1412 left his wife not only her legal share but additional bequests, calling her his most beloved companion. A noblewoman in 14th century Castile wrote to her absent husband with evident warmth, mixing household business with personal longing. These were not universal experiences, but neither were they impossible. Affection, respect, even tenderness could develop within the structure of duty. Women, for all the constraints they faced, were not entirely without recourse. Canon law recognized that marriage required the free consent of both parties, and that consent could be vitiated by force, fraud, or incapacity. A woman whose husband proved impotent could petition an ecclesiastical court for annulment, though the process was invasive and humiliating. Witnesses might be called, physical examinations conducted. The case of one 14th century Englishwoman dragged on for years, her husband insisting the fault lay with her coldness, she countering that he had never successfully consummated the marriage. The court ultimately ruled in her favor. She was free to remarry. He was not. Impotence was proof of an invalid sacrament. It undid the bond entirely. Cruelty offered narrower grounds. A husband who beat his wife beyond what local custom deemed reasonable, who endangered her life, or who forced her into acts the church condemned, could face separation of bed and board. This was not divorce. Neither party could remarry, but it allowed a woman to live apart, with some legal protection for her property and person. Cases were rare, and success depended heavily on family support, local reputation, and the willingness of ecclesiastical judges to intervene in what was still considered the domestic sphere. Most women endured. Some fled. A few fought back. The records are thin, but they exist. The marital debt, for all its theological precision, played out in a world of exhaustion, hunger, crowded sleeping spaces, and the grinding realities of survival. A woman who had spent the day hauling water, kneading bread, tending livestock, and nursing an infant might have little energy left for conjugal obligation. A man who worked dawn to dusk in the fields, who shared a single room with children and aging parents, who worried over debts and failed harvests, faced his own limits. The church's vision of ordered, procreative intimacy assumed a degree of privacy, health, and leisure that many households simply did not possess, and yet the rules remained. The debt was owed. The sacrament demanded its due. What emerges from the tangle of theology, law, and lived experience is a picture of marriage as both rigid and negotiated, a space where doctrine met compromise, where the ideal of mutual obligation existed alongside the messy realities of bodies, emotions, and circumstance. The marriage bed was never simply private. It was monitored by confessors, constrained by calendars, and shaped by the belief that every act of intimacy carried moral consequence. But it was also, for many, the only lawful place where desire could be expressed, where affection could grow, where the next generation could be conceived. The Church insisted on control. Couples found ways to live within it, or around it, or despite it. Yet, not all desire fit within the boundaries of marriage, and the Church was acutely aware of the many forms of sin that lay beyond it. The Church did not leave the definition of sin to chance or personal interpretation. From the earliest centuries of Christian practice, bishops and abbots compiled lists of transgressions and their corresponding penalties, creating manuals that guided confessors through the messy terrain of human weakness. These penitential handbooks, some dating back to the 6th and 7th centuries in Ireland and Britain, treated sin as a kind of spiritual illness requiring precise diagnosis and measured remedy. By the high medieval period, such texts had proliferated across Europe, their pages dense with categories and subcategories that divided desire into a taxonomy of guilt. The manuals were exhaustive in their attention to detail. They distinguished between fornication committed by the unmarried, adultery involving at least one married party, and incest defined by varying degrees of kinship or spiritual relation. They accounted for frequency, asking whether the act had occurred once in a moment of weakness or repeatedly over months and years. They noted the status of the sinner. Clergy faced harsher penalties than lay people, and those in holy orders who violated their vows could expect years of fasting on bread and water, exclusion from the Eucharist, and public humiliation. A laywoman who fornicated once might be assigned 40 days of penance. A priest guilty of the same act could face 3 years. The mathematics of transgression were coldly specific. Certain acts were deemed so grave that they occupied their own hierarchies of severity. Sodomy, a term applied broadly to any non-procreative sexual act, but especially to relations between men, was frequently equated with heresy and sometimes treated as worse than murder. Theologians reasoned that while murder destroyed a body, sodomy defied the natural order established by God and threatened the soul's salvation. Civil and ecclesiastical authorities agreed. In many regions, those convicted of sodomy faced execution by burning, the same punishment reserved for obstinate heretics. Bestiality, though rare in the records, provoked similar horror and was punished with equal brutality. The animal involved was often killed alongside the human perpetrator, as though the act had corrupted both beyond redemption. These penalties reflected not merely moral outrage, but a deep anxiety about boundaries between human and animal, natural and unnatural, order and chaos. Yet the penitential system was not solely punitive. It also offered a pathway back to communion with the Church, and, by extension, with the Christian community. Confession was the hinge on which this system turned. Before the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, confession had been encouraged but not universally required. That council, convened by Pope Innocent III, issued a decree that would reshape the spiritual lives of millions. Every Christian of the Age of Reason was obligated to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year, typically during Lent, and to receive the Eucharist at Easter. This mandate intensified clerical oversight of intimate behavior to an unprecedented degree. The confessional became a space where the most private acts were spoken aloud, catalogued, and judged. Confessors walked a delicate line. Pastoral manuals instructed them to question penitents thoroughly enough to uncover hidden sins, but gently enough to avoid planting sinful ideas in innocent minds. A confessor was not to ask a young unmarried woman directly whether she had committed fornication, lest the question itself become a source of temptation or scandal. Instead, he might ask whether she had sinned against chastity, allowing her to shape her own admission. If she remained silent or vague, he could probe more specifically, guided by the likelihood of certain sins given her age. marital status, and circumstances. Married women might be asked whether they had used herbs or pessaries to prevent conception, or whether they had denied their husbands the marital debt without legitimate cause. Married men faced questions about whether they had sought pleasure in positions or acts prohibited by church teaching, or whether they had been unfaithful. The confessional was both ritual and interrogation. It required the penitent to name the sin, express contrition, and accept the assigned penance. That penance varied widely. Minor infractions might be resolved with a few prayers or a brief fast. More serious sins demanded public acts of restitution. A man known to have committed adultery might be required to walk barefoot through the streets of his town on a specified day, dressed in a plain penitential tunic, while a priest proclaimed his offense to the gathered crowd. He might be barred from entering the church building itself and made to stand in the porch or churchyard during Mass, visible to all but excluded from the sacrament. Such public penances served multiple purposes. They humiliated the sinner, deterred others, and demonstrated the church's authority over moral life. Women accused of sexual transgression faced particular scrutiny and particular humiliation. A woman who bore a child outside marriage might be required to stand before the congregation holding the infant, confessing her sin aloud before being readmitted to communion. The emphasis on visibility and shame reveals how deeply the community participated in the regulation of intimate behavior. Sin was never entirely private. It threatened the social fabric, invited divine punishment, and required collective witness to its correction. This communal dimension persisted even as confession became more institutionalized and clerically controlled. The system, for all its rigor, was also surprisingly flexible. Confessors exercised discretion. A penitent who confessed out of genuine remorse might receive a lighter sentence than one who seemed indifferent or defiant. Poverty, illness, or coercion could mitigate the severity of penance. A woman who had used contraceptive herbs because another pregnancy would have killed her might be treated more leniently than one who acted out of vanity or convenience. Confessors were encouraged to consider intent, context, and the likelihood of reform. This pastoral pragmatism tempered the law's theoretical harshness, though it also opened the door to inconsistency and favoritism. Not all penances were public or physical. Many involved acts of charity, feeding the poor, making a pilgrimage to a local shrine, endowing a chantry chapel, or donating goods to a monastery. These acts reintegrated the sinner into the economy of Christian virtue, transforming guilt into generosity. They also reinforced the church's economic power and social centrality. A wealthy merchant who had kept a mistress might be required to fund the construction of a chapel or the establishment of a hospital. His sin, once confessed and penanced, became a visible monument to redemption and ecclesiastical authority. The cumulative effect of this system was a society in which intimate behavior was subject to constant surveillance and periodic reckoning. People grew up learning the vocabulary of sin, the gradations of guilt, the procedures of confession. They knew which acts were venial and which mortal, which could be resolved quietly, and which demanded public exposure. The confessional shaped how they understood their own desires, their marriages, and their bodies. It created a shared moral grammar, spoken in every parish and every diocese, linking the peasant and the nobleman, the wife and the widow, the priest and the penitent. The Church's focus on sin was particularly intense when it came to its own clergy, who were supposed to embody celibacy, but often did not. The Church's focus on sin was particularly intense when it came to its own clergy, who were supposed to embody celibacy, but often did not. In the year 1320, Pierre Clergue, the parish priest of Montaillou in the Pyrenees, was living openly with Beatrice de Planasoles, a widowed noblewoman who had borne children to 2 husbands and would later testify before the Inquisition about their relationship. Pierre was not unusual. Across medieval Europe, thousands of priests kept women in their households, fathered children, and navigated the gap between canonical prohibition and daily compromise. The ideal of clerical celibacy, so central to the Church's identity and authority, collided constantly with the stubborn realities of desire, loneliness, and the economics of rural parish life. The requirement that all priests remain celibate was not ancient tradition, but a relatively recent imposition. In the early Church, many clergy had been married, and even bishops sometimes lived with wives. But during the 11th century, a wave of reformers centered in Rome launched what became known as the Gregorian Reform, named for Pope Gregory VII, who reigned from 1073 to 1085. These reformers sought to purify the church by eliminating two practices they saw as corrupting simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and Nicolaitism, the term they used for clerical marriage and concubinage. The reformers argued that priests who lived with women were tainted by worldly attachments, and that their children might inherit church property, turning sacred office into dynastic possession. Celibacy, in this vision, would set clergy apart, making them more like angels and less like laymen. The First Lateran Council in 1123 formally prohibited priests from marrying, and the Second Lateran Council in 1139 declared all existing clerical marriages invalid. Priests who refused to leave their wives faced suspension or excommunication. In some regions, bishops expelled women from rectories and forbade priests from employing female servants under a certain age. Reforming preachers traveled through towns and villages urging laypeople to boycott masses celebrated by unchaste clergy. The rhetoric was harsh. Women who lived with priests were called concubines, whores, and pollution. The sons of priests were labeled bastards, barred from inheriting benefices, and sometimes denied legitimacy altogether. But enforcement proved far more difficult than legislation. In many rural parishes, the priest was the only educated man for miles, appointed by a local lord or bishop who might be hundreds of miles away. Visitation by higher authorities was infrequent. A priest might live in a modest house adjacent to the church, farm a bit of glebe land, collect tithes in kind, and struggle to make ends meet. In such circumstances, having a woman to manage the household, cook, launder vestments, tend animals, and provide companionship was not merely convenient but nearly essential. Some priests entered arrangements that resembled common law marriage in all but name. They called their partners housekeepers or servants, but everyone in the village knew the truth. Synodal statutes and visitation records from across Europe document the persistent struggle to impose celibacy. In 13th century England, bishops repeatedly issued decrees forbidding priests to keep women or acknowledging children. In France, diocesan synods fined priests who cohabited and threatened suspension for repeat offenders. In the Holy Roman Empire, church visitors recorded lists of priests living with concubines, noting their names, the number of children, and the years of cohabitation. Yet the same names often appeared again in later visitations, the fines paid or ignored, the relationships continuing. Some bishops grew weary of the battle. A few imposed an annual tax on concubinage, creating a system where priests could essentially purchase tolerance. The tax became a steady source of revenue, and the fiction of enforcement replaced actual reform. Laypeople responded with a pragmatism that clerical reformers found exasperating. In many villages, parishioners preferred a priest with a stable concubine to one who seduced married women or pursued the daughters of farmers. A priest with a family was seen as settled, predictable, less likely to cause scandal. Some communities even provided housing for the priest's women and children, viewing them as part of the parish fabric. When reforming bishops tried to expel these women, villagers sometimes protested or petitioned for the priest's reinstatement. The gap between official teaching and local tolerance created a kind of moral doubleness. People confessed their sins to priests, who were themselves living in states the church defined as gravely sinful, and no one seemed to find this arrangement entirely unworkable. The Inquisition records offer rare glimpses into the emotional and social textures of these relationships. Beatrice de Planisols testified that Pierre Clergue had pursued her persistently after her second husband died, visiting her home, offering gifts, and eventually persuading her to accept him as a lover. She described their intimacy in matter-of-fact terms, noting that Pierre used a certain herbal contraceptive wrapped in cloth to prevent conception, a detail that scandalized the inquisitors but reveals the calculated nature of clerical concubinage. Beatrice was not a powerless victim. She was a noble woman who owned property and had social standing. Her relationship with Pierre gave her protection and companionship in a village where alliances mattered. When the affair ended years later, she moved on to other relationships, including one with another priest. Her testimony suggests that some women found agency and even affection within arrangements the church condemned. Other women had less favorable outcomes. Penitential records and court cases describe priests who used their authority to coerce or exploit. A priest might demand intimacy from a woman seeking penance, or threaten to withhold sacraments from a family unless a daughter complied. The same clerical status that made a priest an attractive partner for a widow like Beatrice could become a tool of predation in the hands of others. Ecclesiastical courts occasionally prosecuted such cases, especially when they became public scandals, but the proceedings were slow, the penalties often mild, and the burden of proof lay heavily on the accuser. Women who brought charges risked their reputations. Many chose silence. The church hierarchy understood the problem but could not solve it. Reforming councils in the 13th and 14th centuries reiterated the demand for celibacy, tightened regulations on female servants, and called for stricter supervision. Yet the system lacked the administrative capacity to enforce uniformity across thousands of parishes. Bishops relied on archdeacons and rural deans to conduct visitations, but these officials were themselves often guilty of the same offences. A visitation report might dutifully record a dozen priests living with women, recommend fines or penances, and then note that the archdeacon himself kept a concubine in his own household. The machinery of reform turned slowly and accomplished little. By the late 14th century, the issue had become a fixture of clerical satire and lay complaint. Poets mocked priests who preached chastity while warming the beds of parishioners. Moralists listed clerical concubinage among the signs of ecclesiastical corruption that demanded reform. In some regions, reformist movements like the Lollards in England used clerical unchastity as evidence that the church had forfeited its spiritual authority. Yet even harsh critics often distinguished between priests who kept one woman in a stable arrangement and those who lived dissolute lives of serial seduction. The former, while sinful, seemed comprehensible and manageable. The latter threatened the social order and invited divine wrath. The lived reality of clerical concubinage was neither simple vice nor romantic rebellion. It was a negotiated compromise born of isolation, economic pressure, human need, and the limitations of institutional control. Priests who kept women often rationalized their choices by noting that they avoided worse sins, that they supported their households honorably, or that the prohibition itself was unreasonable and unenforceable. Lay people who tolerated these arrangements weighed theological purity against practical benefit. The result was a system of public fiction and private accommodation, where everyone knew the rules were being broken but life went on regardless. The church maintained its ideal of angelic celibacy in sermons and statutes, while the lived church, the one built of stone and thatch in 10,000 villages, contained men who lit candles, heard confessions, and went home to women whose names never appeared in any official record. Outside the church and the marriage bed, medieval society maintained a parallel economy of sanctioned and tolerated unchastity. The medieval city was never a place of pure order. Narrow streets wound between timber and stone, channeling foot traffic past workshops, taverns, market stalls, and the occasional open sewer. By the 13th century, urban populations were swelling across Europe, and with growth came the complications of density, crime, disease, noise, and the presence of those who lived and worked outside the boundaries of respectable household life. Among them were the women who sold intimacy for coin, and the civic authorities who decided that vice, if it could not be eliminated, might at least be organized. The official stance was blunt. Prostitution was sinful. Theologians agreed on that much. Augustine himself had written centuries earlier that removing prostitutes from a city would unleash chaos like draining a sewer and flooding a palace. Thomas Aquinas echoed the reasoning, better to tolerate a lesser evil than provoke a greater one. This logic, rooted in the mechanics of male desire and the perceived fragility of female honor, shaped urban policy across late medieval Europe. Brothels were licensed, mapped, taxed, and regulated, not because authorities approved, but because they believed the alternative was worse. Young men, apprentices, soldiers, travelers, Those without the means or inclination to marry all posed a potential threat to the daughters and wives of respectable households. A sanctioned outlet, confined to a particular quarter and subject to municipal oversight, was seen as a tool of public order. The legal architecture varied by region, but the underlying structure was consistent. In Avignon during the 14th century, the city maintained a public brothel under the supervision of appointed officials. Prostitutes working there were required to register, pay fees, and submit to periodic inspections. Similar arrangements existed in Southwark, across the Thames from London, where the Bishop of Winchester held jurisdiction over the so-called stews, a cluster of bathhouses and lodgings where commercial intimacy was conducted under ecclesiastical license. In Nuremberg, city records from the late 1400s describe a municipal brothel staffed by a house mistress responsible for maintaining discipline, collecting rents, and ensuring that women did not entertain clients on holy days. The irony was lost on no one. The same church that condemned fornication collected revenue from those who committed it. Women working in licensed brothels occupied a legally precarious position. They were permitted to ply their trade within designated boundaries, but their presence elsewhere was restricted or outright forbidden. Sumptuary laws required them to wear distinctive clothing, a yellow veil in Toulouse, a striped hood in Florence, a red badge in Vienna. These markers served as both advertisement and warning, a visual boundary between the tolerated and the respectable. Residence was similarly controlled. In many cities, prostitutes were barred from living near churches, schools, or family neighborhoods. They clustered instead in designated quarters, often near city gates, along waterfronts, or in districts already associated with transience and disorder. The rules extended to conduct as well. Women could not solicit openly on the street, accost married men, or work during Lent or Holy Week. Violations brought fines, public whipping, or expulsion from the city. Yet enforcement was uneven. Court records suggest that authorities intervened primarily when violence occurred, when disease spread, or when public complaint grew loud enough to demand action. The daily transactions, negotiated in rented rooms or behind tavern walls, mostly escaped official notice unless someone was injured or a theft reported. Entry into this economy followed diverse paths. Some women arrived through destitution, widows without family support, rural migrants unable to find domestic work, unmarried mothers abandoned by their lovers. All faced limited options in a world where female labor was poorly paid and closely supervised. Prostitution, for all its dangers and stigma, offered a measure of autonomy and immediate income that washing laundry or spinning wool did not. Inquisition testimony and court depositions occasionally preserve voices. A woman in Marseille explained that she had turned to the trade after her husband died and left her with debts. Another in Paris described fleeing an abusive master and finding work in a bathhouse, where the line between service and intimacy was negotiable. Others entered through coercion. Procurers, often women themselves, recruited or deceived young women with promises of domestic work or marriage, then delivered them to brothels and held them through debt or threat. Legal records describe cases where women attempted to escape and were dragged back, beaten, or locked in upper rooms. Yet the picture was not uniformly bleak. Some women moved in and out of the trade as circumstances shifted, working seasonally or episodically. A few accumulated enough capital to retire, marry, or establish themselves in other occupations. Documents from late medieval Florence mention former prostitutes who purchased houses, opened taverns, or funded dowries for younger relatives. The economy of vice, like most medieval economies, was shaped by necessity, but it allowed for negotiation. Bathhouses occupied an ambiguous social space. They served a legitimate function. Medieval people bathed more often than the caricature allows, and urban bathhouses offered hot water, steam, and grooming services unavailable in most private homes. Men and women visited separately or during designated hours, paid a small fee, and enjoyed a rare opportunity to shed the grime of daily labor. Some bathhouses were attached to hospitals or charitable foundations. Others operated as private businesses. The problem, from the perspective of moralists, was that bathhouses also functioned as sites of assignation. Private rooms, attendants willing to provide more than a towel, and a transient clientele created opportunities that civic authorities found difficult to regulate and impossible to ignore. Illustrations in manuscript margins and legal complaints alike depict bathhouses as spaces where respectability dissolved along with clothing. Men and women reclined in wooden tubs, shared meals, and conducted business both commercial and carnal. The vocabulary was revealing a visit to the baths could mean hygiene, sociability, or something else entirely, and everyone understood the layered meanings. City councils issued periodic ordinances attempting to separate the respectable from the illicit. Bathhouse keepers were instructed to refuse entry to prostitutes, ban mixed bathing, and close early on Sundays. Compliance was inconsistent. Visitation records from 14th century Germany describe inspectors finding men and women bathing together despite explicit prohibitions, and bathhouse owners shrugging when questioned. Periodic crackdowns followed predictable patterns. Plague outbreaks triggered moral panic and regulatory zeal. Officials closed brothels, evicted prostitutes, and proclaimed that divine wrath had descended because of communal sin. Preachers delivered thunderous sermons linking pestilence to sexual vice, and city councils passed ordinances banning public women from the streets. The measures rarely lasted. Once the immediate crisis passed, economic pressures and the persistent demand for services reasserted themselves. Brothels reopened under new management or in slightly shifted locations. Bathhouses resumed normal operations. Women returned to the designated quarters, and civic authorities returned to the work of managing what they could neither fully suppress nor openly endorse. The tension was structural. Medieval cities were complex organisms sustained by trade, craft production, pilgrimage traffic, and the constant circulation of people and goods. Young men migrated for apprenticeships, merchants traveled for business, soldiers garrisoned near urban centers, and ecclesiastical courts brought clerics and litigants from across regions. All of this mobility created demand for temporary lodging, food, entertainment, and intimacy. To eliminate prostitution would require either universal marriage or universal celibacy, and neither was remotely feasible. The compromise was pragmatic, regulation without endorsement, tolerance without approval, a system designed not to sanctify vice but to contain its consequences. The economic logic extended to gender. Male clients faced little legal risk. Fornication was a sin. Confessors reminded penitents of that, but prosecution was rare and punishment light. Women bore the visible stigma, the legal restrictions, and the physical dangers of the trade. They could be fined, beaten, expelled, or subjected to public humiliation, while the men who employed them faced few consequences beyond a confessor's admonition. This asymmetry reflected broader assumptions about desire, agency, and social order. Women were understood to be either guardians of household honor or vectors of disorder, and prostitutes occupied the latter category by definition. Yet they were also understood to perform a service, absorbing male desire that might otherwise threaten the structures of marriage and legitimate kinship. By the 15th century, some cities began experimenting with reform. Brothels were moved further from residential areas, regulations tightened, and charitable institutions founded to rehabilitate women willing to leave the trade. The Magdalene houses, named for Mary Magdalene, offered shelter, work, and religious instruction to former prostitutes seeking a path back to respectability. Success rates were difficult to measure. Some women stayed, others left after a few weeks. The pull of economic necessity, the difficulty of securing respectable employment, and the simple fact that many women had nowhere else to go meant that prostitution persisted despite the best efforts of reformers. What remains visible across all this regulation and moralizing is the sheer ordinariness of the practice. Prostitution was woven into the fabric of medieval urban life, neither celebrated nor successfully suppressed. It existed in the gap between ideal and reality, between theology and necessity, and civic authorities managed it with the same pragmatic attention they brought to market inspection, waste disposal, and fire prevention. The women who worked in brothels and bathhouses were not abstract symbols of vice. They were participants in an economy that offered them few alternatives, and they navigated its dangers and opportunities as best they could. The question of what constituted sinful desire was not limited to heterosexual transgression. The Church also legislated extensively on acts it deemed unnatural. The question of what constituted sinful desire was not limited to heterosexual transgression. The Church also legislated extensively on acts it deemed unnatural. In the year 1277, a Parisian knight named Jean de Moon completed the second half of the Roman de la Rose, a sprawling allegorical poem that had captivated courtly audiences for decades. Buried within its thousands of lines was a defense of procreative intimacy so emphatic that it condemned any act incapable of producing children as a violation of nature itself. The poem was copied, read aloud, and debated across Europe. Its condemnation of sterile pleasure reflected a deeper medieval anxiety that certain acts threatened not merely the soul of the sinner, but the very order of creation. Medieval theologians and jurists understood sodomy as a category far broader than modern readers might expect. The term, drawn from the story of Sodom in Genesis, encompassed any form of non-procreative intimacy. This included relations between men, relations between women, anal or oral acts between spouses, solitary pleasure, and even coitus performed in positions deemed contrary to nature. The common thread was not the gender of the participants, but the absence of the possibility of conception. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the Summa Theologica, ranked sodomy among the gravest of carnal sins, placing it above fornication and adultery because it violated the natural law inscribed by God into the order of the cosmos. Where adultery betrayed a human vow, sodomy betrayed the purpose for which bodies had been fashioned. It was, in the language of the schools, a sin against nature itself. This theological position had roots in Augustine, who had argued in the 5th century that any use of the generative organs contrary to their created purpose was inherently disordered. By the 13th century, canonists and theologians had refined and codified this view into an elaborate hierarchy of transgression. Gratian's Decretum, the great synthesis of canon law, devoted several chapters to unnatural acts, citing authorities from Scripture, the Church Fathers, and papal decrees. Penitential manuals listed specific penances: 7 years of fasting for repeated sodomy between men, 5 years for the same act between women, 3 years for anal intercourse within marriage. The severity reflected not merely the act itself but its implications. To desire in ways that could not yield children was to reject the gift of fertility, to pursue pleasure divorced from purpose, to invert the hierarchy that placed reason above appetite. Yet the anxiety ran deeper than theology alone. Medieval Europe understood gender as a cosmic principle woven into the structure of reality. Men were hot and dry, women cold and moist. Men planted seed, women received and nurtured it. The body was a microcosm of divine order, and acts that confused or inverted this order threatened to unravel the fabric of creation. Legal sources reveal the visceral fear such acts inspired. A French legal code from the 13th century prescribed burning at the stake for sodomy, the same punishment reserved for heretics. The link was explicit. Both crimes rejected the natural and revealed order. Both invited divine wrath upon the community. In 1260, a canon from the Council of Narbonne declared that those who committed sodomy should be defrocked if clergy, and handed to secular authorities for execution if lay. The crime, the council insisted, was so grave that silence or tolerance would bring plague, famine, and earthquake upon the land. The association between sodomy and heresy was nowhere more pronounced than in the campaign against the Cathars of southern France. The Cathars, dualist Christians who believed the material world was created by an evil god, rejected procreation as the perpetuation of souls in corrupt flesh. They practiced strict celibacy and condemned marriage as a snare of the flesh. Inquisitors, chroniclers, and preachers seized upon these teachings to accuse Cathars not merely of theological error, but of unnatural vice. The term bougre, derived from Bulgar and used to describe Cathars, became a slur implying sodomy. Whether the Cathars actually practiced such acts remains unclear. The historical record is poisoned by the rhetoric of their persecutors. What is clear is that by the early 13th century, unnatural desire and heretical belief had become fused in the minds of Orthodox Christians. To commit sodomy was to align oneself with forces hostile to God, nature, and community. The punishments meted out for sodomy varied wildly depending on status, location, and the vigor of local enforcement. A monk caught in intimacy with another monk might face expulsion, public penance, and lifelong exclusion from the sacraments. A peasant accused of the same might be burned if local authorities were zealous, or merely fined and shamed if they were not. Urban records from Florence, Bruges, and London reveal sporadic prosecutions, often sparked by public scandal or the testimony of jilted lovers and angry neighbours. Wealth and connections could buy silence. In 1326, a nobleman in Toulouse was accused of keeping a male lover. The case was quietly dropped after a substantial donation to the bishop's coffers. The poor, lacking such leverage, faced the full weight of law and custom. A labourer in Venice, caught in 1348, was paraded through the streets, whipped and banished for life. The inconsistency was not hypocrisy so much as the reality of a world where law was mediated by power, patronage, and local discretion. Despite the severity of doctrine and the sporadic brutality of punishment, evidence suggests that same intimacy did occur, quietly and often invisibly, across medieval society. Monastic communities, where men lived in close quarters for decades, generated anxious legislation. Visitation records and chapter meeting minutes repeatedly admonish monks to avoid sleeping two to a bed, to keep dormitory doors open, to refrain from lingering alone with younger brothers. The repetition of the prohibitions suggests the persistence of the behaviours they sought to suppress. One 15th century abbot in England complained that certain monks formed particular friendships that excluded others and fostered jealousy within the community. He did not specify what such friendships entailed, but the coded language was enough to prompt disciplinary action. Military settings likewise offered spaces where same desire could find expression. Soldiers and knights lived in camps, shared tents, and formed bonds forged in danger and proximity. A few chroniclers, writing with evident distaste, mention warriors who preferred the company of boys or squires. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, was rumoured by some contemporaries to have shared his bed with the King of France during a diplomatic visit in 1187. Whether the relationship was intimate or merely a display of political alliance remains debated by historians. The rumours themselves, however, indicate that such possibilities were imaginable, even if rarely spoken aloud. Urban spaces provided other opportunities. Bathhouses, taverns, and inns became sites of fleeting encounters and whispered arrangements. Inquisition records occasionally capture glimpses of same desire, though the testimony is always filtered through the lens of accusation and confession. A man in Bologna, questioned in 1392, admitted to relations with another man, but insisted it had happened only twice, that he had been drunk, and that he had since confessed and repented. Whether his account was truthful or strategic is impossible to determine. What the record reveals is that such acts occurred, that they were sometimes discovered, and that the accused navigated a dangerous terrain between silence, denial, and measured admission. Women who desired other women appear even more faintly in the sources, in part because medieval society struggled to conceptualize such acts. Since penetration and seed were understood as essential to the carnal act, intimacy between women was harder to categorize. Some theologians classified it under sodomy, others under pollution or mutual stimulation. Penitential manuals assigned lighter penances for acts between women than for acts between men, perhaps because they seemed less capable of fully inverting the natural order. A few legal cases survive. In 1377, 2 women in northern France were accused of living together in a manner that scandalized their neighbors. The records do not specify what they were alleged to have done, but both were required to separate and perform public penance. The silence around female same desire was not necessarily tolerance. It may have been a failure of imagination, a refusal to acknowledge what could not easily be named. The boundaries of the natural and the unnatural were not fixed. They shifted with the needs of power, the anxieties of reform movements, and the exigencies of local order. Yet throughout the medieval period, sodomy remained a potent symbol of disorder, a line that defined by negation what was permissible and right. To cross that line was to place oneself outside the community of the faithful, to risk not only punishment in this life, but eternal damnation in the next. The severity of the condemnation reveals how deeply medieval Christianity invested the body with cosmic significance. Every act, every touch, every moment of desire was a moral event with implications that reached beyond the individual to the health of the entire social and spiritual order. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, these interlocking systems of belief and regulation began to shift under the pressures of plague, urbanization, and religious reform. In the autumn of 1347, a Genoese trading ship arrived in the port of Messina, carrying not only spices and silks, but also black rats infested with fleas, and within those fleas, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Within 3 years, roughly 1/3 of Europe's population was dead. The plague killed indiscriminately, but its effects on the living were anything but uniform. For those who survived, the world that emerged from the pestilence was one in which labor was scarce, land abundant, and the old certainties about marriage, household, and the proper ordering of society suddenly negotiable. The late medieval period, from the mid-14th century to the dawn of the 16th, was a time when catastrophe and innovation reshaped intimacy in ways both visible and subtle, as plague, economic upheaval, and new technologies of communication began to erode the structures that had governed family life for centuries. The immediate demographic shock of the Black Death disrupted marriage markets across Europe, with so many dead, particularly in cities where the plague raged most fiercely. The pool of eligible spouses shrank dramatically. Young women who might have entered domestic service or awaited arranged marriages found themselves suddenly valuable in a labor market desperate for workers. Wages for both men and women rose, sometimes doubling or tripling within a decade. This shift gave many survivors, particularly women and laborers, a degree of economic agency unthinkable before 1347. A servant who had once earned 2 pence a day might now command 5, and a widow who inherited her husband's workshop or land could choose whether to remarry or remain independent. Church records from the late 14th century show a temporary spike in the number of women living as heads of household, managing property, and delaying remarriage. The bargaining power of brides increased as well. Dowries became more negotiable, and women from non-noble families occasionally secured marriage contracts that granted them control over their own property, a privilege once reserved for the wealthy. Yet this moment of opportunity was fragile and contested. Landlords and urban guilds, alarmed by rising wages and the erosion of traditional hierarchies, enacted laws designed to freeze labor mobility and cap wages. The English Statute of Labourers in 1351, for example, attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of workers seeking better terms. Similar ordinances appeared across France, Italy, and the Low Countries. These laws were difficult to enforce, but they reflected a deep anxiety among elites about the social order. The plague had not merely killed, it had scrambled the calculus of obligation, deference, and control. In this unstable environment, marriage ceased to be only a matter of family strategy and sacramental duty. It became, for some, a site of negotiation and choice. Late medieval cities, swollen with migrants from depopulated countryside, became laboratories for new forms of household life. Urban couples, particularly artisans and merchants, increasingly chose their own spouses, though still within the constraints of parental approval and economic compatibility. Church courts in cities like York, Paris, and Florence recorded disputes over broken betrothals, contested consent, and clandestine marriages, revealing a world in which young people exercised considerable agency in matters of affection. The ideal of companionate marriage, a partnership based on mutual affection and shared governance of the household, began to appear in sermons, vernacular poetry, and advice literature. This was not a revolution in sentiment. Arranged marriages remained the norm, particularly among the nobility and rural gentry, but the texture of expectation had shifted. Husbands and wives who worked side by side in workshops managed urban households together and navigated the complexities of guild membership and civic life, came to see each other not only as partners in procreation, but as collaborators in survival. Medical and devotional literature, once the preserve of clerics and physicians, began to circulate more widely with the advent of new copying technologies, and, by the mid-15th century, the printing press, Johannes Gutenberg's movable type press, operational by 1455 in Mainz, transformed the speed and scale at which texts could be reproduced. Within decades, printed books appeared across Europe, and among the earliest bestsellers were works on health, household management, and moral conduct. The Trotula, a collection of texts on women's medicine, was printed in multiple editions by the late 15th century, making advice on conception, childbirth, and gynecological ailments accessible to a broader readership. Devotional manuals, books of hours, and guides for confessors also proliferated, bringing theological doctrine and moral instruction into the hands of lay people who could read or who had access to someone who could read aloud. This diffusion of knowledge had paradoxical effects. On one hand, print democratized access to medical and theological ideas, allowing urban families to consult remedies for infertility, advice on raising children, and guidance on preparing for confession without relying solely on the parish priest or the traveling healer. On the other hand, the standardization of texts reinforced orthodox teachings, making it harder for heterodox beliefs to flourish unchallenged. Printed penitential manuals and conduct books circulated uniform lists of sins and penances, eroding the flexibility that had once existed when confession was an oral private exchange between penitent and priest. The same technology that empowered lay readers also empowered institutions to monitor and regulate belief. Moral reformers seized on the new medium. Urban preachers, particularly Franciscans and Dominicans, delivered fiery sermons calling for stricter discipline in dress, behavior, and intimacy. In cities like Florence, Siena, and Merg, reformers campaigned against prostitution, gambling, and ostentatious display, framing these as threats to civic virtue and divine favor. Some cities responded by expelling prostitutes or closing bathhouses, though such measures were often temporary and reversed when economic or political pressures shifted. The rhetoric of reform intensified in the wake of repeated plague outbreaks, which many preachers interpreted as divine punishment for collective sin. The association between moral laxity and epidemic disease gave reformers a powerful tool, and the pulpit became a platform for demanding greater surveillance of the body, the household, and the marriage bed. This intensification of moral scrutiny was not uniform. In some regions, particularly in Italy and the southern Low Countries, civic authorities maintained a pragmatic approach to prostitution and public morality, licensing brothels and regulating vice rather than attempting to eliminate it. In others, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of France, reform movements gained traction, foreshadowing the more sweeping transformations of the 16th century. By the late 15th century, the groundwork for both Protestant and Catholic reform was being laid, not in theology alone, but in the structures of daily life, the confessional, the printed page, the household economy, the urban guild. By 1500, the medieval synthesis of theology, medicine, and law that had governed intimacy for centuries remained influential, but it was beginning to fragment. New ideas about conscience, individual responsibility, and the inner life were emerging in humanist circles, in the writings of figures like Erasmus of Rotterdam and Thomas More, and in the quiet choices made by urban couples navigating marriage in a world of print, plague, and precarious prosperity. Privacy, once a luxury reserved for the very wealthy, became more attainable as urban houses grew taller and more subdivided, creating separate spaces for sleeping, eating, and work. The invention of the chimney and the glass window, though still rare, allowed for warmer, more enclosed domestic environments. These material changes, small in themselves, contributed to a gradual shift in how people experience the boundary between public and private, between the obligations owed to community and church and the interior life of the household. The household itself was becoming a different kind of institution, no longer simply a unit of production and reproduction overseen by patriarchal authority and ecclesiastical supervision. It was increasingly imagined as a space of affection, negotiation, and individual conscience. This transformation was incomplete, contested, and unevenly distributed across regions and classes. but it was underway. The late medieval household, shaped by catastrophe and innovation, stood at the threshold of a world in which intimacy would be subject to new forms of scrutiny, new possibilities for choice, and new anxieties about control. These transformations set the stage for the upheavals of the Reformation and the slow, uneven shift toward modern understandings of intimacy, consent, and bodily autonomy.